And Spencer Stuart is here this morning. Spencer's on the show from time to time talking about the history of publishing. And this morning he's talking about a kind of book that might be under a tree near you at some point over Christmas. And I'm talking about movable books or pop-up books and how they came to be.
You know, with movable books, they have early beginnings, the 1300s, with astrology, and then it builds into medicine and things of that nature. One of the earliest movable books is Matthew of Paris, and it was created by him to predict times within the astrological calendar. And those were volvelles. They were basically movable discs in a book. And then if you think about children's books, into the latter part of the 1700s, you start to see books that are geared towards kids.
What kinds of things were there?
They were sort of flat books. So one of the first ones that you find is a bookseller by the name of Robert Sayer, and in the 1770s, but he would have pamphlets at the front of his store. They're known now as harlequinades because there was usually a harlequin character in them. So they were basically one piece of paper that was folded several times and then cut with flaps so that kids could reveal a story as they went along. And what happens is you see booksellers sort of doing it as a smaller production. And then we go into the 1800s, and the middle part of the 1800s is when you really see the creation of movable books for children really ramping up. And you see publishers, in fact, create their own departments for these productions because there's really a structure to movable books that's profoundly different than a regular book, as you can imagine. And they even have, the term now within the 20th century, you see the word paper engineer often in relation to pop-up books. And it's absolutely true. You have to use thicker papers, and you have to think about what happens when you open the page and how that moves certain parts and how those wear over time. And so how could you make things stronger?
What are some examples that stand out for you from around that mid-1800s point, Spencer?
Well, I'd say, probably some of the Dean and Son productions from the 1850s. Those were British productions. They did a kind of scenic tour book, which allowed kids to sort of get a sense of the environs. There's some really incredible productions that come out of Germany in the 1870s, 1880s. And those are particularly connected around someone who's believed as kind of one of the most amazing book creators of that time, Lothar Meggendorfer. At that time, you see books maybe having one or two elements on the page moving. Mm-hmm. His productions were 5, 6, 7 elements on one page moving.
Talk about engineering.
Unbelievable. And you can look behind them and actually see the parts. They were kind of more mechanically moving. You think of, there are pop-up books, and then there are pull tabs, right. And then sometimes you'll see mechanical moving books, and those are kind of more like sticks that come out, almost like shadow puppets. In some cases, there are elements that move and will also trigger movements elsewhere. So there's really a magic to those books. And you get that later on in the 1890s with another German bookmaker, Ernest Nister, who did these dissolvable image books.
What do you mean?
The images would slide similar to Venetian blinds. So you could move a tab which would slide the image from one to another. It's it's somewhat similar to the technology you see of the old advertisement boards, mm-hmm. but within a book. I mean, it's really incredible. Yeah. So those ones are really kind of exceptional pieces. And I would say that one of the interesting things about the history of the intensity of the 1800s in terms of the innovation of children's books is it really is part and parcel with the change in education systems towards children. So, in the 1780s, you see the emergence of the Sunday school movement, and that really starts to think about providing some form of education towards kids. And just to put that in perspective, in 1800, there were about 200,000 kids who were enrolled in Sunday schools of one form or another in the UK. And by 1850, there were 2.5 million.
Whoa!
What
an explosion!
And so often the development of children's books in the 1800s is kind of a timeline that you put that next to the development of education movements and really a kind of a change in the society's perception of children and childhood. And you see this in a lot of the pieces in around the time of 1780 and the Sunday school movement's development. They're moral tales. 1810, there's S&J Fuller's Paper Dolls series with little Fanny, who kind of makes her way through the world and has pitfalls. She's lost for a period of time and then comes back to her family and things of that nature. And another interesting development that happens in the 1800s is the Public Libraries Act of 1850, and that starts to create the infrastructure through which books can be distributed to people and to children. And then ultimately in 1870 with the Elementary Education Act. And so if you put that alongside the development of movable books for children, you start to see that this was really, a kind of an industry where the publishers were responding to demands that were happening in the society and vice versa. And the Americans do it in a totally different way.
How so?
When they start out in the 1880s is some of the earliest instances of some pop-up books coming out of America, and they are direct bootlegs of Dean and Sons from 1850 in England. So the McLaughlin brothers, which were well known, they made these affairs that were, considerably cheaper. But what happens is that it gets bigger and bigger and starts to balloon, and you see in 1930s the Blue Ribbon Publishing Company does Puss in Boots and Tarzan and themes relating to Walt Disney characters. And that's actually where the word pop-up book comes from.
Okay.
They were sort of believed to be the publishing company that coined that term.
And those were the ones where you actually opened the page and a little vignette stood up, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And they're kind of like, they're sort of models that, continue to this day. In some cases, they came with little characters and things like that. Right after World War II, there was a gentleman by the name of Waldo Hunt, and he started a company called Intervisual, which became the pop-up book company internationally after the war. By 1996, they'd published 1,000 titles connected to pop-up books. And those were very much the ones that I remember as a kid. Those were the ones. There's one, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it was The Human Body. It came out in 1983, and it was by Jonathan Miller and David Pelham, and it was a pop-up book of the body. It was just like this unbelievably detailed. There was one where it was the face, and it came out and the eyes kind of moved somewhat by opening it, and that's definitely something that paper engineers think about, like how can the act of opening the book or turning the page have a sense of movement to it and really, bring the book alive.
Can you tell us about one that you've seen in your work with collections that really stands out for you, Spencer?
I think, one of the ones that by a paper engineer and book designer from the Czech Republic, what is now the Czech Republic, would have been Czechoslovakia when it was made. It was created in 1956 by a gentleman named Wojciech Kobaszta, Little Red Riding Hood. The illustrations, the movement, as we were talking about, the kind of movement of the characters as the pages turn, it's a step above anything that's being made at that time. There was actually an explosion in the 50s even in that area around pop-up books, which inspired a lot of the work that we were mentioning earlier about Intervisual, the American group. That was one of those instances where it was like, okay, this is the next level. This is the way that they can be made. I think that's kind of an interesting thing, and it really connects to European history of childhood stories. It's very different from the British style and the way those stories were crafted. So I think that one's really nice. It's really rich, and it has an exploration of childhood, which is really fascinating, I think.
That's Spencer Stuart, and Spencer is a collections consultant. He deals with all kinds of collections, including books. And I'm going to post a few pictures of that Red Riding Hood book that he was just talking about there on the Facebook group. So if you're on Facebook, you can go have a look at that.